Though we may be consumed with the hustle and bustle of our lives, yet we may be reminded of how we were, and how we are, and what we may become at this most blessed time of the closing of the year. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Read by Karl. Stave 1. Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon the exchange for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know, of my own knowledge, what there was particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined, myself, to regard a toffin nail as the deadliest piece of ironmongering in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand should not disturb it while the country is done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat, emphatically, that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole friend, and sole mourner. Even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There was no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind, upon his own ramparts, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning after dark on a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above the warehouse doors, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people knew the business called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but the answer to both names was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted head of the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as a flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature about always with him. He iced his coffee in the dog days, and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose. No pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. No one ever stopped in the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever at once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him. When they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and not courts, and they wagged their tails as if they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep his distance, was what the knowing ones called nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal. He could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warn them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down and stirring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, and he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the cook's fire was so much smaller it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted it would be necessary for them to part. Whereupon the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself with a candle, in which effect, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breast smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come, then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What right even have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer right in the spur of the moment, said, "Bah!" again, and followed it up with, "Humbug." "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be?" returned the uncle. "When I live in such a world of fools as this Merry Christmas. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? Time to finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer. Time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen of months prevented dead against you if I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly. "Every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." "Uncle," pleaded the nephew. "Nephew," returned the uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mind." "Keep it?" repeated Scrooge's nephew. "But you don't keep it." Let me leave it alone then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you?" "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas and the rest. But I am sure I've always thought of Christmas time, when it has come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name of origin, if anything, belonging to it can be apart from that. It's a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of, in the long calendar of the year, when one woman seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people will bow them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound into other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded, becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety. He poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge. You'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder why you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression, said he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" cried Scrooge's nephew. "Why?" "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if it was the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, Uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why gave us a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We've never had any quarrel, to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returns them cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge. We overheard him, my clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife, family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam. This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood, with their hats off, in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe, said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years, Scrooge replied. He died 7 years ago this very night. We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner, said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. 100,000 are in want of common comforts, sir. Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses, demanded Scrooge, are they still in operation? They are, still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill and the pole are in full vigor, then said Scrooge. Both very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it. Under the impression that they scarcely furnished Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of worth. We chose this time because at a time when all others, when want is keenly felt, and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing, replied Scrooge. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone, said Scrooge. Since you ask what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I work to support the establishments I mentioned. They cost enough. And those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know what, but you might know it, observed the gentleman. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business, not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Seeing clearly it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labours with an improved opinion of himself and a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with foreign links, preferring the services to go before horses and carriage and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always pealing slowly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the well, became invisible, and struck the hours and quarters on the clouds, with tremendous vibrations afterward, as if his teeth were chattering in his frozen head up there. The cold became intense. And the main street, at the corner of the court, some laborers were repairing the gas pipes, and there was a great fire in the brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in a rapture. The water plug being left in solitude, its overflowing sullenly congealed and turned to misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops where hollyhocks and berries crackled in the warm lamplight of the windows made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, from which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do with it. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty Mansion House, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as the Lord Mayor's household should, and even the little tailor, for whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and the baby sailed off to buy the beef. Foggier yet and colder. Piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as this, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to a lusty purpose. The odor of one's scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol, But at the first sound of God, yes, ye merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay, Scrooge seized the roar with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length the hour of shutting up the county house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tactically admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop you at half a crown for you, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'd be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed it was only once a year. "Poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all day earlier next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, where he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in order for it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blindman's Bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner at his usual melancholy tavern, having read all the newspaper, and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. There were a gloomy suite of rooms in a towering pile of building up yard where it had so little business to be that one can scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide and seek with other houses and forgotten the way out again. It was old enough, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if Genius of Weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now it is a fact, there was nothing at all peculiar about the knock on the door, except that it was very large. It was also a fact that Scrooge had seen it, night and morning, during his whole residence at that place. Also that Scrooge has a little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, aldermen, and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his dead partner's passing that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not in a penetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on his ghastly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air. Though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That, its livid color, made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of this face and beyond its control rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution, before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified by the sight of Marley's pigtails sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he said, "Pooh-pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above, and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below, appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door, and walked across the skull, and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs, or through a bad young Act of Parliament, but I mean to say you might have gotten a hearse up that staircase, and taken it broadwise, with the splitter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge suddenly saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't avoid the entry too well, so you may suppose it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for it. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his room to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as it should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel, Scrooge got a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus occurred against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cain's and Abel's, Pharaoh's daughters, Queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abraham's, Belshazzar's, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. One smooth tile had been a blanket first, with power to shape some picture on the surface from the disjointed fragrance of his thoughts. There would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. "Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns he sat down again. As he threw his head back in his chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten, with his chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with strange inexplicable dread, that as he looked, he saw the bell began to swing. It swung so softly outside that it hardly made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, or a minute, but it seemed like an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. There was succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if the person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound. They heard a noise much louder on the floors below. They're coming up the stairs. They're coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His colour changed, though, when, without a pause, he came within the heavy door and passed the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up, as though it cried, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about its middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he never believed it until now. Nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the shining face with death-cold eyes and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which Robert he had not observed before, he was still incredulous and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." I was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. I can. Do it then. Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know where a ghost such as Trent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. Felt that in the event of it being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me, observed the ghost. I don't, said Scrooge. What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses? I don't know, said Scrooge. Why do you doubt your senses? Because, said Scrooge, a little thing affects them. Slight stir of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel, in his heart, by any means waggish then. The truth is, he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention, and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit, staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge did not feel it himself, but that was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven. You see this toothpick? Said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it was only for a second, to divert the vicious snooty gaze from himself. I do, replied the ghost. You're not looking at it, said Scrooge, but I see it, notwithstanding. Well, returned Scrooge, I have but to swallow this and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all from my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug! At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook his chain with such an appalling and dismal noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling into a swoon. But how much greater was in horror when the fact of taking off the bandage around its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. Mercy, he said. Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind, replied the ghost, do you believe in me or not? I do, said Scrooge. I must. But why do spirits want the earth? And why do they come to me? It's required of every man, the ghost returned, that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit does not go forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me! And witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness. Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. You are fettered, said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. I made it link by link, and yard by yard. I girded it around my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Scrooge trembled more and more. But would you know, pursued the ghost, the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was as full and heavy and long as this 7 Christmas Eve ago. You have laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. Jacob, he said importantly. Oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob. I have none to give, the ghost replied. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me! In life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me yet. It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. You must have been very slow about it, Jacob, Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference. Slow? The ghost repeated. 7 years dead, mused Scrooge, and travelling all the time. The whole time, said the ghost. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. You travel fast, said Scrooge. On the wings of the wind, replied the ghost. You must have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years, said Scrooge. The ghost, upon hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night, that the warden must have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. Oh, captive, bound, and double-ironed, cried the phantom, not to know that ages of incessant labour by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in this little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I. But you were always a good man at business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who was now began to apply this to himself. Business! Cried the ghost, wringing his hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings in my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. It held up its chain at arm's length, as if they were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. At this time of the rolling year, the spectre said, I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise man to a poor abode, whither no poor homes to which his light would have conducted me? Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre go on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. Hear me, cried the ghost. My time is nearly gone. I will, said Scrooge, but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray. How is it I appear before you in shape as you may see, I may not tell. I have sat invisible behind you many and many a day. It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. That is no light part of my penance, pursued the ghost. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You were always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. You would be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice. It is. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first when the bell tells 1. Could I take them all at once and have it over? Jacob hinted Scrooge. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your own sake, and remember what has passed between us. When it had said these words, the spectre took his wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this, but the smart sound its teeth made when their jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with his chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward with him, and at every step it took, the window raised a little, so when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost set up his hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear. From the raising of the hand, he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together, none were free. Many had been known personally to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost, in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who tried piteously, being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant who was sobbed below upon a doorstep. The misery with them was, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human affairs, and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures fell into mist or mist shrouded them, he could not tell. But day and the spirits faded together, and the night became as it had been when he had walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable. And being for the emotion he had undergone and the fatigues of the day, or the scopes of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed, without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. Stave 2, the first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that, looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavouring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes, when the chimes of a nearby church struck the 4 quarters. So he listened for the hour. To great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12. It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten to the works. 12. He touched the spring of his repeater to correct this most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. "Why, it isn't possible," said Scrooge. "I have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and that is 12 at noon." The idea being alarming, when he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything. I could see very little then. All I could make out was it was still very foggy and extremely cold. There was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten out bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after sight of this first of exchange paid to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, or his owner, and so forth, would have become a mere night security if there were no more days to count by. Scrooge went to bed, and again thought and thought and thought it over and over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought of it, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavoured not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after Mercure inquired that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the time had gone 3/4 more, remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour had passed, and considering he could no more go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long, he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. "Ding dong!" "A quarter past," said Scrooge, counting. "Ding dong!" "Half past," said Scrooge. "Ding dong!" "A quarter to it," said Scrooge. "Ding dong!" "The hour itself," said Scrooge triumphantly, "and nothing else." He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, so the curtains of his bed were drawn. Aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of the drawing room were bent aside, and Scrooge stared up into a half-recumbent attitude, finding himself face to face with the unlucky visitor who drew him as close to it as I am now to you, and am standing in the spirit of your elbow. It was a strange creature, like a child, not so like a child. I was like an old man, viewed from some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view, and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if his holds were of uncommon strength. His legs and feet, most delicately formed, were like those upper members bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in a singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was, that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which was now held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality, for as its belt sparkled and glimmered now in one part now in another, or was light one instant and another time was dark, So the figure itself fluctuated distinctness between now a thing with one arm, now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. In the very wonder of this, it would be again distinct and clear as ever. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, certainly low, as if instead of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. "Who and where are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarf stature. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge should not have told anybody why, for anyone could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. "What?" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough you are one of those whose passions made this cap? Forced me through whole trains of weird years to wear it low upon my brow?" Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend, and only knowledge of having wilfully bothered the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him here. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong hands that spoke and grasped him gently by the arm. "Rise and walk with me." It would have been vain for Scrooge to plead the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes. The bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing. Then he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and he had a cold upon him at the time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication. "I am immortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall, stood upon an open country road with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness in the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. "Good heavens," said Scrooge, clapping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit glanced upon him mildly. His gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's extensive feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 hours floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was but a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would. "You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it!" cried Scrooge with fervor. "I can walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, till a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were seen turning toward them, with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirit and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "They are but shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The jocund travellers came on. As they came, Scrooge knew and named every one. Why, he was rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them. Why did his cold eye glisten, his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other old Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good had it ever done him? The school was not quite deserted, said the church. A solitary child, neglected by your friends, is left there still. Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane. Soon approached the mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock surmounted cupola on the roof, and the bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were a little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach houses and sheds were overrun with grass. Nor was it more retentive of his ancient state within. For entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthly savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, and melancholy room, made bare still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these a lonely boy was reading, near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form, and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. Not a wait and echo in the house, not a squeak and scuffle from the mice behind the paneling, not a drip from the half-thawed water-spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of one despondent poplar, not the idle swimming of an empty storehouse door, no, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence and gave a freer passage to his tears. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window, with an axe stuck in his belt and leading by the bridle an ass laden with wood. "Why, it's Ali Baba," Scrooge explained in ecstasy. "It's dear old honest Ali Baba." Yes, I know. One Christmas time, when yonder solitary child was left all alone, he did come for the first time just like that. Poor boy. And Valentine, says Scrooge, his wild brother Orson, there they go. And what's his name? He was put down his drawers asleep by the gates of Damascus. Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the genie. There he is upon his head. Servant right, I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess? To hear Scrooge expending all the earnest of his nature on such subjects, a most extraordinary voice between laughing and crying, and to see his heightened and excited face would have been a surprise to his business friends in the city, indeed. "There's the parrot," cried Scrooge. "Green body and yellow tail with a thing like a lettuce growing on the top of his head. There he is. Poor Robinson Crusoe," he called him, when he came home again after sailing round the island. "Poor Robinson Crusoe. Where have you been, Robinson Crusoe?" The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for his life to the little creek. "Hello, hello, hello!" Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking about him, drying his eyes with his cuff, "but it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge, "nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. Should have liked to have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved his hand, saying as he did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell on the ceiling, and the lake lists were stony instead. But how else was it brought about? Scrooge no more than you do. He knew it was quite correct. Everything had happened so, and there he was, alone again, with all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously toward the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms about his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as her dear, dear brother. "I've come to bring you home, dear brother," said the child, clasping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, the brimful of glee. "Home for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is ever so much kinder than he used to be. That home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man," said the child, opening her eyes, "and you are never to come back here, but first we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world." "You're quite a woman, little fan," explained the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on a tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness toward the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there." In the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious uh, condescension, threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. And they conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlour that ever was seen, when the maps upon the wall, the celestial and terrestrial globes in the window were waxy with cold. Here he produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered and indulged some of those dainties to the young people at the same time, sending out a meagre servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tab as he had tasted before, he had rather not. Master Scrooge's trunk being this time tied on the top of the chaise, the children bade the schoolmaster goodbye right willingly. Getting into it, drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the hoarfrost and snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. Oh, was a delicate creature, whom my breast might have withered, said the ghost, but she had a large heart. So she had, cried Scrooge. You're right. I will not gainsay a spirit. God forbid. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, as I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, said the ghost. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, yes. Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops, that here too it was Christmas time again, but it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it, said Scrooge. I was apprenticed here. They went in. At the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if it had been 2 inches taller he might have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig. Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again. Old Fezziwig went down his pen and looked at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself, which fused to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, airy, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick! Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. Dick Lincoln's, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear. Yo-ho, my boys, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands, before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged the street with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, had them up in their places, 4, 5, 6, barred and pinned them, 7, 8, 9. Came back before you got to 12, panting like racehorses. Hilly-ho! Cried old Fezziwig, skipping out for the high desk with wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hi-ho, Dick, cheery up. Ebenezer, clear away. There's nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. Was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The fire was swept in water, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire. The warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk, and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 600 followers whose heart they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. It came from the boy from over the way, who suspected of not having board enough for his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door, but one who proved to have her ears pulled by her mistress. In the old cave went up the other, some shyly, some boldly, some graciously, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In all they came, over anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again, the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping, old top couple always turning in the wrong place, new couple couple starting off again as soon as they got there. All top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, the old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest, upon his reappearance, he instantly began again. There were no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home, exhausted on a shutter, and he were a brand new man, resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came out from the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, and an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you and I could have told it him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. The old Fezziwig stood up to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple too, with a good stiff big piece of work cut out for them. 3 and 4 and 20 pairs of partners. People who were not to trifle with. People who would dance and have no notion of walking. Would have been twice as many. 4 times old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher and I'll use it. Positive light appeared to issue from them. They shone every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't predict at any given moment what would become of them next. And when they had all gone through the dance, advanced to retire, brought hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrews for the needle and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs and came up on his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic bell broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everyone had retired but the 2 apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were up to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. So until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from him, he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon his head burnt very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small," echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the 2 who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, "Why? Is it not he who spent but a few pounds of your mortal money? 3 or 4, perhaps? Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. "It isn't that, spirit. He had the power to render us unhappy, or happy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say, this power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant it is impossible to add and count them up. What then happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing," said the spirit. "Something, I think," the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge. "No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." His former self turned on the glance as he gave utterance to the wish. Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick!" This was not addressed to Scrooge or anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the hard and rigid lines of later years, but had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye, which showed the passion had taken root, and where the shadow of a growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat at the side of a fair young girl in a morning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. "It matters little," she said softly. "To you, very little. And not idle has this place made. If it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" Eve rejoined. "A golden one." "That is the even handling dealing of the world," he said. There's nothing upon which is so hard as poverty, nothing professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth. You fear the world too much, she answered gently. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I've seen your noble aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then, he retorted. You have I grown so much wiser. What then I have not changed towards you? She shook her head. A contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor, content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man. I was a boy, he said impatiently. Your own feeling tells you you are not what you are, she returned. I am. That which promised happiness when we were one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. But often how keenly I've thought of this I will not say. It's enough I have thought of it. I can release you. Have you ever thought release? In words? No, never. In what then? In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, another atmosphere of life, another hope was his great end, and everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. This has never been between us, said the girl, looking mildly with steadiness upon him. Tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now? Ah, no. He seemed to yield to the justice of this supposition, in spite of himself, but he said with a struggle, You think not? I would gladly think otherwise if I could, she answered. Heaven knows, when I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong the resistance must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, could even I believe that you would choose the dowerless girl, who your very confidence was her weigh everything by gain, or choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to your one guiding principle to do so, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you. With a full heart, for the love of him you once were. He was about to speak, when the head turned from him, she resumed. You may, the memory of what is half past makes me hope you will, have pain in this. A very, very brief time, when you would dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream, for which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen. She left him when they parted. Spirit, said Scrooge, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me? One shadow more, explained the ghost. No more, cried Scrooge, no more. I do not wish to see it. Show me no more. But the restless ghost pinioned him in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. There was another scene in place, a room, not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the last that Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. The listener was perfectly tumultuous, for there were more children than Scrooge, in his agitated state of mind, could count. And unlike the celebrated herds in the poem, they were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, but every child was conducting himself like 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much, and the latter, soon beginning to mingle in the sports, got pillaged by the young brigands most ruthlessly. What would I have not given to be one of them? Though I could never have been so rude, no, I wouldn't for all the wealth of the world have crushed that braided hair and torn it down. For the precious little shoes, I wouldn't have plucked it off. God bless my soul to save my life. As a measure here waste in sport, as they did, bold young brood, I couldn't have done it. Should have respected my arm to have grown round it for a punishment, and never come straight again. Yet I should dearly like now to have touched her lips, to have questioned her. She might have opened, to have looked upon the lash of her downcast eyes, and never raised a blush, to have let loose waves of hair, an inch of which I would keepsake beyond price. In short, I should have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and to have been man enough to know its value. But now a knocking at the door was heard. Such a rush immediately ensued that she, with laughing face and plundered dress, was borne toward it to the centre of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who came home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and the struggling, the onslaught that was made on the defenseless porter, the skilling him with cheers with lighters to dive into his pockets, spoiling him with brown paper parcels, hold on tight by his cravat, hung around his neck, pommel his back, and kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was received. The terrible announcement that the boy may be taken in the act of putting a doll's frying pan into his mouth and was more suspected of having swallowed a fictitious turkey glued on a wooden platter. The immense relief of finding us a false alarm. The joy and gratitude and ecstasy. They are all indescribable alike. It's enough that by degrees the children and mushers get out of the parlour, and by one stair at a time, up to the top of the house when they went to the bed, and so subsided. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter reading and fawning on him, sat down with her mother and his own fireside, and when he thought that such another quiet creature, quite as grateful and full of promise, might have called him father, but in springtime and the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "Bill," said the husband, turning his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon." "Guess. How can I, Tut? Did I know?" she added in the same breath, laughing as he laughed. "Mr. Scrooge." Mr. Scrooge it was. It passes out of his window, and as it was not shut up and had a candle inside, I can scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe. "Spirits," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you they were shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me," Scrooge explained. "I cannot bear it." He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that looked upon him with a face, in which there was some strange way there were fragments of all the faces that had shown him, were wrestled with it. "Leave me, take me back, haunt me no longer." In the struggle, if that can be called a struggle in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed his light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with his influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form, but though Scrooge pressed it down with all its force, he could not hide the light which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further of being in his own bedroom. He gave the pad a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and he barely had time to reel to dead before he sank into a heavy sleep. To be continued.